The second scripture lesson is a continuation of Matthew's account. I will read from chapter 27, verses 27 through 54. Listen now for the word of the Lord. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. They put a reed in his right hand and knelt before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And after mocking him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him. And then they led him away to crucify him. As they went out, they came upon a man from Cyrene named Simon. They compelled him to carry his cross. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall. But when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided his clothes among themselves by casting lots. Then they sat down there and kept watch over him. Over his head they put the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." Then 2 bandits were crucified with him, one on the right hand and one on the left. And those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes and elders, were mocking him, saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross now, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he wants to, for he said, 'I am God's son.'" The bandits who were crucified with him also taunted him in this way. From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani?" That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "This man is calling for Elijah." At once, one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." And then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And after his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now when the centurion and those with him who were keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were terrified and said, "Truly, this man was God's Son." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. How can it be that it took 1,000 years for images of a suffering and crucified Christ to appear in the world? While the earliest surviving Christian art found in underground tunnels and tombs of Roman catacombs showed images of Abraham, Isaac, and a ram, of Jonah coughed up by a sea monster, of Daniel between 2 pacified lions, of a Samaritan woman drawing water from a well, of John the Baptist baptizing Jesus, and of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, Not one image depicted Jesus crucified or dead. At least not for 1,000 years. For 1,000 years, Jesus crucified and dead did not show up in catacombs and churches, monasteries and mosaics. The oldest crucifix to survive, the Garo cross, was created around the year 965 and is found in the Cathedral of St. Peter and Maria in Cologne, Germany. It seems that for 1,000 years, the death of Jesus was neither an image of devotion or a symbol of faith. What are we to make of this? Surely art historians have studied this. By looking at the earliest Christian art, they can illuminate for us what Christianity did mean to the church during those first 1,000 years. But what would the absence of Christ's crucifixion mean to you? What could Christianity without the presence of Christ's suffering and death possibly mean to the church and to the world? We cannot take for granted the centrality of Jesus' passion and crucifixion in our faith. Throughout its history, the church has wrestled with its significance. We know the disciples wrestled with it. We know they struggled, shocked as they were by the terror of it, to make sense of it. We can imagine that the people in the crowd who witnessed and shouted for Jesus' death sentence went home and wrestled with it. In Matthew's account, we hear that even Pontius Pilate struggled with his conscience and tried to wash his hands of its injustice, saying to the crowds, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." And what about the Jewish religious authorities of Jesus' day? We know that two members of the Sanhedrin, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, must also have felt conflicted. In the dark of night, they took Jesus' body down from the cross, washed and wrapped it, and gave him a proper burial in the family tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Given all the grief and all the guilt, what would it mean then to erase, ignore, or omit Christ's crucifixion? In her book, Why Religion?, well-known historian of religion Elaine Pagels asks this question in her own quite personal way. She reflects on why Christianity became for her not only a matter of professional academic study, but also a matter of personal conviction and faith. In the beginning of her book, she recalls the innocuous brand of the Christianity of her childhood, portrayed in Autumn Salmon's portrait of Jesus, with fine feminine hair, blue eyes, harmless and earnest, and another picture of him, his hands clasped on a rock, prayerfully entreating his Father in heaven. I remember these portraits of Jesus hanging in the Sunday school room of my hometown Presbyterian church. In contrast to these serene images of Jesus hanging on the walls of the white clapboard Methodist church she attended as a child, were the images of Jesus she remembered from a nearby Catholic church, where heavy wooden doors swung open into a dark hall that led into a sanctuary lit only with candles, down the hall from which one would find 12 stations of the cross that led to a crucifix suspended, with a wooden body on it, streaked with blood, a crown of thorns pressed into the head of a tortured man who did not look anything like the Methodist Jesus she was used to. Only ever entering that church with her best friend who would disappear into a confession booth to whisper to someone behind a screen, she was always relieved to step back into the sunlight. Elaine Pagels writes of having grown up in a home where intense emotions were mostly suppressed and religion felt flat and whitewashed. But in her teenage years, the sudden tragic death of a dear friend, passionate and misunderstood, as well as the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, inevitably introduced into her young life dark, passionate, and turbulent clashes. Then in her adult years, the death of her 6-year-old son caused by a rare and fatal heart and lung condition, followed 1 year later by the sudden accidental death of her husband, left her reeling in massive grief. In her search for a world, even a universe, that could make room for and hold the full emotional passion of life, no matter how messy, extreme, and tragic, she turned to religion, Christianity specifically. Not the Christianity of her childhood, but biblical Christianity that she says led me beyond the reach of my family, the beige living room, uncomfortable silences at the dinner table. She longed to know who Jesus was, the man who preached that the world was ending and that God's kingdom was coming, who himself had come to a cruel end, humiliated, tried, tortured, and killed by his enemies. She took her time understanding the passionate invitation to eat bread and drink wine as if they were his body and blood. What kind of hunger drives us to come together, sing, pray, and share a meal like this? She wondered. It's true. Our faith drips with passion. Jonathan Edwards, preacher of the Great Awakening that swept across America and resulted in the religious conversions of multitudes, wondered how anyone could not be affected by hearing of the glorious perfections of God, the great works of God, the unspeakable love of God and Christ, the sweet invitation of the gospel, and of the great things that Christ has done and suffered. True religion, he believed, in great part consists in the affections. I do not know the latest research on the emotions, and so I don't know if this lesson about the emotions that I'm about to share with you would be considered viable today. But I do know that I have found it true in my experience. It's a lesson I came across in reading what John Dewey wrote about the emotions. When it comes to the emotions, he wrote, every emotion has an object. Emotional awareness requires awareness of the object to which our feelings are attached. The more specific the object, the more manageable the emotion. In my own experience, I have found it harder to manage emotions that are so generalized that they color everything in the path. A general sense of anger that colors how you feel about everything, for example, can be overwhelming. I think one of the most difficult things about the Christian story in Holy Week, beginning with Palm Sunday, is that there are so many emotions at work, it is nearly impossible to untangle them, to put them in order. Such extreme feelings of confidence, celebration, and euphoria converge with feelings of vulnerability, fear, sorrow, and grief. The praise and gratitude expressed by the crowds converge with their aggression and bloodthirstiness. We experience what grief specialist David Kessler calls a gang of feelings. As we hear all that happens to Jesus, we can feel the overwhelming sense of being so emotionally ganged up on that we can no longer distinguish among the emotions or among the objects of the emotions. And just as the psalmist in Psalm 31 laments what it feels like to be persecuted, the distress, grief, sorrow, sighing, misery, horror, and dread, He can no longer distinguish who it is that is whispering about him, who it is that is scheming against him, plotting to kill him. It feels instead like a general terror that is all around him. According to David Kessler, who wrote with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on grief and grieving, finding the meaning of grief through the 5 stages of loss, grief can be one of those generalizable emotions that, if we're not careful, can color everything in the same hue. Being interviewed recently, David Kessler was asked if he would agree that much of what people are generally feeling in this time of pandemic is grief. He responded, yes, and we're feeling a number of different griefs. We feel the world has changed, he says, and it has. The loss of normalcy, the fear of economic toll, the loss of connection. We're also feeling, he said, anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is that feeling we get about what the future holds when we are uncertain. Usually, it centers on death, and we feel it when someone gets a dire diagnosis or when we have the normal thought that we'll lose a parent someday. Anticipatory grief also includes more broadly imagined futures. There's a storm coming. There's something bad out there. And with the virus, this kind of grief breaks our sense of safety. We are feeling that loss of safety. When asked what we can do to manage all this grief over so many different losses, including the losses we anticipate, David Kessler responded with things you likely already know, but may find difficult to put into practice. First, come into the present. And second, let go of what you cannot control. I invite us to try these practices, not only because there are losses we are grieving due to the pandemic, but also because our religion has at its core Jesus Christ crucified and dead. We will not whitewash or omit his suffering and death. That in love for us, Christ suffered, was crucified, and died, it is central to our faith. And the grief that we feel vicariously during Holy Week lasts all year, and so does the guilt. So often it is the case that guilt accompanies grief. As Christ's followers today, we cannot help but feel vicarious guilt for what the first followers of Christ did or failed to do. As long as Christ's crucifixion is central to our faith, Christians have to learn how to live with grief and guilt. Speaking about the guilt she suffered when her young son died, Elaine Pagels remembers during those dark, interminable days of his illness, I couldn't help imagining that somehow I had caused it. Only much later did I realize the truth. I'd rather feel guilty than helpless. For guilt, however painful, often masks a deeper agony, even more unbearable. There is an illusion of control that we have to let go if we want to move with Jesus through Holy Week. I've heard it said that emotions need motion. When grief for what we have lost and for what we anticipate overwhelm us, Jesus, who came to be with us, invites us to come into the present. And when guilt for what we have done and for what we have failed to do weighs us down, Jesus invites us to let go of our illusion of control and to place our trust in God. Even on this walk to the cross, Jesus is our teacher, teaching us that we can learn to live with loss.